I'm really excited to talk about research today, as this is where my own passion lies. So as a curious little girl, I was excited to ask questions and understand why things are the way they are. As a high school science teacher, I created space for my students to challenge the status quo. And even as a mother, testing hypotheses when my newborn is crying or observing really closely to try to learn what makes my 3-year-old laugh, in some ways I feel like I am always and have always been a researcher. But as I began my more formal research career, I felt really frustrated and deeply disconnected from the issues and, most importantly, the individuals I was hoping to learn with and from. And research is traditionally often done on rather than with. And this realization really led me in my grad school career to explore participatory research. So what do I mean by participatory research? Even though I'm trained as a traditional researcher, so I like to use slides. So I'm going to share my screen briefly and go through a few slides. So bear with me for one moment. Can we see my screen? Thumbs up from one. Great. Okay. So what do I mean by participatory research? I want to spend a few moments sort of grounding us in my working definitions of participatory research, heavily borrowed from scholars and community members. And I'm actually really excited to have my own notions challenged and expanded in our conversation today. So participatory research is an umbrella term for research designs, methods, frameworks, and most importantly, epistemologies that use systematic inquiry in direct collaboration with those affected by an issue for the explicit purpose of action or change. So said another way, participatory research always includes stakeholders, those who are involved, served, or affected from the initial design all the way through the execution of the process, data collection, data analysis, and to the application of research toward change. So I pulled this quote from a piece actually written by one of our panelists, Dr. Fine, that I think sums it up really beautifully. Participatory action research projects are born in dissent, strengthened by difference, organized through a bumpy democracy, and motivated by desire for contestation and justice. As I mentioned, I think of participatory research as an umbrella term, and there are many other sort of versions, so to speak, or instantiations of PR. Depending on the field of study or discipline, I've seen participatory action research, community-based participatory research, or even transformative participatory evaluation, just to name a couple. And if you notice, all of these terms include either the word participatory, action, or community. And while these frameworks differ somewhat, some are directly focused on youth, for example, they generally ascribe to a core set of assumptions or beliefs. So the first is that people don't need advanced degrees or professional credentials to conduct valuable research. Everyone can contribute their expertise, insights, and knowledge. And in fact, those closest to an issue or a problem or program generally know the most about it. Second, PR operates under the belief that all groups and cultures have their own biases, including, and I might add, especially sometimes, professional researchers and evaluators who are trying to remain neutral or objective. And it really troubles this notion of objectivity. Instead, the involvement of diverse participants with really different perspectives can actually help us as researchers to produce insights that are less biased. Finally, in addition to being participatory, PR leads to two sort of main outcomes. The first is that the research is transformative rather than merely informative. So PR is not done when a report is written, and in fact, it doesn't always necessarily result in a report, but instead is applied and connected to the issue or topic under inquiry towards transformative change. Thus, a second and similar outcome is that PR leads to sustainable solutions that empower community members to organize for change. So with all of this in mind, our overarching question for today's conversation is, what does participatory research look like in the criminal legal system? Throughout our conference thus far, I've heard a couple participants actually really frame up this conversation quite well. In conversation with Justin yesterday, Resma noted that in developing his theories of transformation and really engaging in change in the justice system, he noted that most of the time we don't actually include community in the process. I joined an awesome breakout session yesterday on reimagining justice for women, and one of the panelists described her approach to policymaking as ensuring if it is for us, It cannot be without us. So these are all ways at getting at this idea of participatory research. So let's dig in. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we're going to invite our panelists into the conversation. I'd love to start by going around and actually asking each of you to spend about 3 to 5 minutes describing how you connect to this work. So sort of what is participatory research for you? Have you done it and what has that looked like? And I think I'll start, we'll just go alphabetically. So we'll start with Dr. Lozenski with Brian. Can you talk to us about your PAR work?
Sure. Can you all hear me okay? Good morning. I'm happy to be here with you all and this distinguished panel. I'm especially happy to be here with Michelle Fine, whose work has been foundational to my own scholarship, and also my good friend and colleague, Brittany Lewis. And so, yeah, my own context has been doing participatory action research with youth, specifically youth of African descent in the Twin Cities. And what one of the ways, and so what I've found in my own work is that typically when we think about young people and engaging in an action research project, that there are lots of different entry points that young people can take into, or pathways that can be constructed for young people to be able to be engaged in participatory action research. And certainly there are we have more formalized settings with regard to academic literacies and being able to help young people think about what research entails through epistemologies and methodologies. But in my own context, I found that the cultural underpinnings of young people's lives are an incredibly powerful entry point into participatory action research. So thinking about not only the lived practices of young people, but the heritage practices of young people, right? And so often in more formalized school settings, these heritage practices, young people are dispossessed of these heritage practices. And we're talking about whether it's linguistic practices or we're talking about cultural knowledge systems. Sorry, my dog's crying in the background there. We're talking about cultural knowledge systems. And so having that be an entry point for young people. So in my work, what I've done is to create through an ethnic studies lens. So through the study of, through Black studies, African-American studies, Africana studies, to situate PAR as a way to inquire about these knowledge systems and these knowledge contexts, and then apply these ideas and these knowledge systems to the lived reality of young people's neighborhoods, their school contexts, family traditions, all of these other kinds of things, to develop a much more rich and robust understanding of how knowledge is transferred between generations. So this becomes an intergenerational process. Between formalized mechanisms of knowledge transfer, whether that's through schools or churches or family gatherings, right? And then the non-formal spaces as well, where we might think about kind of the liminal spaces that young people inhabit. That often, if we're interested in understanding the lives of young people, we have to understand that I mean, and I think this was already stated, right? That they are the experts of those spaces, right? It's very different as an adult for me trying to ask young people about the intricacies and the intimacies of their lives versus them being able to unearth these, tacit ways of knowing from each other, right? And then being able to theorize that, and then being able to act on that to actually make substantive transformation. So that's kind of the context of the way that I've been engaged in action research with young people.
Thank you so much. I like this idea of entry points, and it'll be interesting to see other folks talk about that. Dr. Lewis, do you want to jump in next and talk about your work?
Hello. I'm Dr. Brittany Lewis, as mentioned before, CEO and founder of Research in Action and a senior research associate at the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. So I think our mission, particularly at Research in Action, is to provide kind of actionable research partnerships with communities that are most impacted. We really believe that real, tangible practice and policy change can only occur when individuals are treated as experts of their own reality. In that process, we have a 6-step equity and action process that we utilize at Research in Action. The first step is assessing the landscape. This is prior to actually going in and partnering officially and engaging in community, where we identify the context, pain points, harms, turnovers, messaging, what happened before we got here, who should be at the table and why, who needs to be brought back to that table, and why, and how can we reconfigure the context under which the conversation will take place. Step 2 is we create an advisory council or action committee, and that is a new table. There has to be folks at the table that have differential power, but community have to outnumber everyone else. That is an ethic or value that we hold up in every project that we lead. The next step in our 6-step process is to co-develop mixed method tools and approaches. We believe deeply in empowering everyone at the table to understand what is a good research question and why we form it together. What are the different research tools or options that are available to us? We teach everyone at the table what those tools are and how to use them. We also co-design each aspect of these tools together. The next step of the process is to kind of collect data. And we also allow all those at the table and community, if they so choose, if they want to go out in the field with us, we will train them. About 20% of folks at the table will opt in for that option, and we'll train them to go in partnership with us to either conduct interviews, focus group surveys, etc. We then do something called shared meaning making. Shared meaning making to us is extremely important. And it's also a big part of the kind of transparency component of our work. Before there's ever a draft of the report, we do some initial thematic coding and analysis, and we bring it back to that table to help make meaning together. We don't want anyone to feel like there's an I got you moment. There's no need for that, because if we're all here for the same strategic reason, we should also give all players at the table the opportunity to move on particular issues or recommendations that they know will come in the final report. And they also get to wrestle with the community prior to that report coming out. The next step in this process is redefining the issues. As we are drafting the report, that group also gets to see parts of that work, meaning nothing is written in the shadows. That's not the intention or goals here. And in the end, we find creative ways to disseminate that information and data to community. Let's be clear, most people are not going to read the 100-page report or the journal article that most scholars in the room will submit to journals and sit in a journal repository that only students get to read. We have done art exhibits. We have done the abridged from the 100 to the 15-page. We do public presentations. We do things that make what we're doing accessible. This also needs to be a tool for everyone involved, both community and the differential stakeholders at the table, so that we have similar language. When we form the advisory council, there's 3 things that are really important. There's shared language, there's shared understanding, and there's kind of shared values. Before we move anywhere in development of tools, we have to actually establish what those are. Meaning there's been lots of data produced that does nothing, and we need to understand why it did nothing, and do we all understand what it means? We also need to understand that there's a lot of words that people throw around, like equity, justice, change, etc., but we all mean different things. So we have to get in the same page about terminology. We also have to get in the same page about our values, and their values really have nothing to do with the research question at hand. It has to do with our humanity as people and why we came to the table in the first place and what our interests are. We all have interests. We need to claim them and then figure out what our strategic coalition really is all about. We do this work in this way because we really want to start off by identifying whether it's institutional harms, impacted partnerships, shared goals and interests, and understanding of historical context, because I argue half the time we all have a different narrative when we come to these tables. We also believe deeply in the co-development of mixed methods tools, both quantitative and qualitative tools, and that people of all walks of life, as Kate mentioned earlier, are doing research, can do research, and should participate in the act of collaboratively researching. And we also don't believe in the idea that something should happen to someone, but it should happen with them, and they should be honored for their expertise. So centering community voices, like bringing those that are excluded from the table historically, is very important. And we also own upfront to everyone that research has been used historically against marginal communities of color. We need to own that history. We need to own that all organizations, nonprofit, government, for-profit, or otherwise, are constantly collecting data to make organizational decisions. And usually those folks that are most impacted by those decisions are not part and parcel to the framework of those questions or the data being collected, or the meaning making of what that data means or how it should impact policy and practice. At Research in Action, we are unapologetic about our investment in changing practice and policy change at the city, county, and state level in a way that reimagines that table and helps us reimagine how we use research.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'll kick it to you next, Dr. Page, if you want to talk about your work sort of in the criminal legal system as well, and kind of how you think about participatory research in that space.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me, and it's great to be on the panel with these wonderful people. When Katie first asked me to participate in this panel, I was a bit hesitant because wasn't sure if I've actually done participatory research before. I'm definitely not an expert on the topic like my fellow panelists. Yet, although my studies may not fit the technical definition of participatory action research, they perhaps fit an expanded conception of it. I tend to think of my research as engaged. By that, I mean I engage directly with people in and around the criminal legal system through the course of the research. And I engage with a broad array of folks during and after the research process who are involved in trying to transform the system or develop alternatives to it. So in a sense, my research has both participatory and action components. And I'll describe a couple of my studies to just give a sense of that. So the first is a study I've been doing with AllSquare. In the summer of, AllSquare is a program in South Minneapolis that combines work in a grilled cheese restaurant with wellness and professional development for people with criminal records. So in 2018, the founder of AllSquare asked if I was interested in studying the program and provide her and her colleagues with honest and even critical feedback. A team of 3 graduate students, and I agreed to collaborate with AllSquare and began the research in 2018. We conducted several rounds of interviews with 2 cohorts of fellows, which is the name that AllSquare uses for the participants. So we developed the study with the folks at AllSquare, but we've had full control over the interview guides, analysis, and publishing. So this was not, just to be totally transparent, this is not research designed with the fellows, but we used a method, longitudinal in-depth interviewing, that allows us that we try to use to understand the fellows' needs, desires, and identify patterns that perhaps are hard to see from those that are leading the program, so that the program can be altered in a way that actually meet the needs and desires of those who are of the fellows. So as part of this collaboration, we've produced 2 reports specifically for AllSquare. So these are not public reports, but reports that are what we think are honest and actually quite critical, and that AllSquare has used to alter the program to make it more responsive to those who are in it. And then we're working on publications and public-facing essays to try to engage a larger discussion of both possibilities and limitations of programs like AllSquare to help those who have the mark of the criminal record. A second study is also collaborative, but it's been collaborative with public defenders here in Minnesota. So On 2 occasions, public defenders that I know, leading public defenders in the state, have come to me with, well, we've had lunch or whatnot, and have brought up issues of concern. One around domestic violence, no contact orders, and issues of racial disparities and how they're used in courts, and the other with pre-sentence investigative reports. And so with them, we designed studies to analyze the use of domestic violence, no contact orders, as well as pre-sentence investigative reports. And so those are in direct participation with system actors. And then those have been used in terms of an action component to actually help those who are representing people in the system to interrogate those tools and to push for change in the system. And then ultimately we would, once we start to publish on this stuff, is to, again, engage more public debate and public-facing publications and so forth. The third project I've done that is participatory is I've been studying the bail bond industry. And for a year and a half, I actually worked in the bail bond industry to study it from the ground up. So actually participating in the system. And let's see here, sorry, just pulling up my notes here. So the reason to do ethnography was, one, this is a very closed system, at least close to those who are not directly entangled with it. And ethnography is a method for trying to understand meaning making in daily life, both for those who are impacted by the system as well as those who operate it. So through this, you can understand how it operates, how it's legitimated, and most importantly, the harms to individuals, communities, and and to communities. So this is much more of a very conventional research project. I wouldn't classify this as participatory action research at all, but it does have an action component. And through this research, I've been able to really engage public debate around bail, both by writing public-facing articles, such as one that really focuses on the role that the harms that bail does to particularly women and low-income women of color that are the primary people that pay the premiums, co-sign the contracts, and are put under social control of the bail bond companies and collections agents and so forth. I've been fortunate enough to present this research to judges, prosecutors, groups. We had a big bail summit here in Minneapolis on bail reform with Minneapolis Foundation, and then also contributing to class action lawsuits. So one in California that's actually has been successful so far, which has sued a huge bail bond company that's been quite deceptive in their contracts and has alleviated $34 million of debt for those who have done contracts. So I say this just as in a way as I think research can also be quite conventional, but have a pretty strong active and participatory element to it with the results. So those are some of the ways I think about it. Again, I'll just leave it there for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And let's kick it to you, Dr. Fine. You've been working in this space for a long time. I'd love to hear a little bit about your work.
Sure. It's great to come last. Thank you, Jamila and Katie, and wonderful to see co-panelists. And Joshua, we'll just consider this under the big tent that I think Dr. Lewis laid out. I guess I want to add a few things to the conversation, not challenge anything, because I think what's been said is pretty exquisite. And I appreciate Dr. Lozenski identifying the importance of privileging the gifts that our co-researchers bring. I appreciate Dr. Lewis honoring that if you're going to bring differently positioned people together, you better be willing to talk about power and value and ethics and white supremacy and academic colonialism. And I appreciate, Dr. Page, your commitment to kind of using research to disrupt dominant lies and to expose harms and to imagine what else is possible. So, I'm a big tent kind of Critical PAR, although I can be really snotty if people are using participatory methods to as inclusion or participation rather than transformation. So I want to introduce some elders that we're all indebted to, talk for a minute about work we've done inside prisons with women who are inside and then criminalized survivors. And Mark, I'll try to talk about what's difficult or challenging about this. For us at the Public Science Project, critical participatory research is about epistemic justice. It's simply about recognizing, as I think Dr. Lewis said, and all of the prior speakers said, that the people most impacted by injustice understand the impact, the capillaries by which harm and oppression operate, the resistance, and what else is possible. There's just a kind of wisdom. I don't want to romanticize that and say the rest of us have nothing to offer, but unless you center that knowledge and experience, I actually think it's problematic to do research about and not with. And maybe that's because I'm a white woman who has not been incarcerated, and who the heck am I in this work? But really for 30 years, we've been doing work with women in prison, out of prison, men and women in and out of prison. And the work is just better. It's more ethical, but it's smarter. The construct validity is stronger. The implications for action are more powerful. The evidence is more compelling. And as many of you said, we use quantitative and qualitative methods. And we work hard to build what Sandra Harding would call strong objectivity. That is bringing very different people around a table to craft together questions of meaning to all of us. The elder I want you to know is a guy named Eddie Ellis. Eddie Ellis died a few years ago. Eddie Ellis was a Black Panther locked up in New York State for more than 20 years. And in the 70s, he formed the Green Haven think tank of men inside, mostly African-American. And then there was another group called La Conciencia of Puerto Rican and Latinx men. And they were a think tank. They were about study and struggle within the facility. And they initiated the 7 neighborhood study because Eddie and friends were saying in the 70s and 80s, where'd all these Black people come from? And they did a statewide survey, and they discovered that they came from 7 major neighborhoods in New York State. And before he died, I said to Eddie, how'd you do this study from inside prison? And he said, a guy named Kenneth Clark used to come in and help us, which is fascinating because Kenneth Clark is often seen as a kind of conservative psychologist because he talked about Black self-hatred, and yet here he had this like closet radical history working inside. In 1985, at Bedford Hills facility, women orchestrated public hearings about the deep, intimate, and perverse relationship between domestic violence and criminalization of women. They held public hearings. Again, knowledge is being produced in hell all the time. Some of us in the academy, if we're going to take up these questions, I would say we have an obligation to be working in solidarity with and to build research practices around. So as somebody said, no research on us without us is very much our motto. 3 examples of projects, and then I'm going to stop. In 1994, then President Bill Clinton yanked Pell Grants out of prisons. I had friends at Bedford Hills. They decided, which is a maximum security women's prison, they decided to mobilize folks on the outside to resurrect college. They asked me to evaluate it. And Joshua, just like the way you were saying, but I said, let's do insiders and outsiders. So we offered a research methods course. 15 women took the course. 7 agreed to participate for 4 years with 7 of us on the outside. For those of you who are interested, there's a report online called Changing Minds, the impact of college on women and their children in maximum security prisons. So that was amazing. And since then, with the exception of Pam Smart, all of those women are out of prison, and we've been doing a lot of work since. I'll mention one current project. New York State has a law mobilized by women who have been what's called criminalized survivors, surviving domestic violence and then criminalized for their attempts to survive that. Women and men who can demonstrate that they've experienced domestic violence while they committed their crime can potentially have their sentences reconsidered. I was asked to document the impact of the law. Again, we put together a large research group of 11 formerly incarcerated women, 9 of whom have also experienced domestic violence. We work with a lawyer, and we're using the research to really hold the state accountable, because as we all know, we can pass laws and nothing happens unless we hold their feet to the fire. So we're a group of about 11. That's the Survivors Justice Project. You can find it online. And we're documenting who has access to this law. We work with a group of women inside who are also a study group who are studying the law. We're noticing who's excluded. We're noticing that men seem to feel more entitled to say, I was experiencing domestic violence, my sentence should be retried, and that for women, the process is littered with grief and responsibility and remorse, and to move from I'm a criminal to I'm entitled to some justice requires a lot more facilitation. It's an amazing project. We have hard conversations, and Mark, this is to your point, when if you dare to have serious conversations with people deeply impacted, and those of us who suffer from what Charles Mills would call an epistemology of ignorance, you run into tensions. There are tensions among our group about how race impacts, who even has evidence to challenge their sentence, because women of color are far more reluctant, for reasons I don't have to tell Minneapolis, to call the cops, right? White women more likely to call the police in domestic violence. So pieces of evidence, who goes to the hospital, who trusts a hospital, for whom have children already been taken away, so there's evidence that they're bad mothers, right? So this question of evidence that looks so objective, we only understand its complexities in our every other Thursday afternoon conversations, where we laugh and cry and hear about cases where folks are getting out and denied. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. I want to pick up this question of sort of challenges and criticisms and kind of go one step up and just kind of open the floor for folks to talk about sort of broadly pros and cons maybe, and the challenges and criticism could sort of fit under the cons perhaps of doing this kind of work. And two things I would love to hear folks pay particular attention to was this question of power, and also this question of ask. So doing research is hard. It is taxing, it's time consuming, and it can be a significant ask for folks, even if we're including them and participating in this process, to engage in this process. So I would love to just throw that out there, and anyone can jump in and answer that.
So I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're asking clearly. You're asking us about the amount of time, energy, and commitment to engaged work.
Yeah, so I think one thing that I think a lot about is when you do, or in an effort to do participatory research, there's a lot of time, effort, and energy certainly put in. And also if you're challenging or digging into specific issues or topics, It might bring up trauma for folks who are involved in the topic you're talking about. It might, unless you have supports in place to engage with folks, I'd just be sort of curious to hear about kind of that aspect of the work. And then also just sort of more broadly, what are other challenges that you've all encountered in there?
So I'll answer your first question, and I want to try to answer the question in the chat a little bit at the same time. I think in engaged work, as you noted, Kate, the issues that community are most impacted by are also the same issues that are making their social, political, and economic lives extremely challenging to survive on a daily basis. So whereas governments, nonprofit, or others have a particular clock on their deliverables or things they're trying to meet, community needed it yesterday. So this question of like a temporal need is never aligned. And I also find it to be fascinating when people come to Research in Action or us at CURA. It comes in two ways. One, they bring it to us at the 9th hour, meaning they were already supposed to do something. They failed in doing it. It didn't go the way they expected it to, and then trying to save face. The other way is they are preempting something that's coming. They've gotten a grant, they've gotten support, and it starts tomorrow, literally. And then they want us all to like shuffle around and figure out how we can contribute. And then I think for the communities that we want to impact, or people say that they want to engage with, there's all this disparate understanding of what is or who is community. And I'm really, really clear when I'm engaging with folks on how to engage with this question. So for instance, we're doing some work right now in Ramsey County. They have this Ramsey County Bail Reform Project, which we've just entered. And the way in which, in my opinion, community was being discussed prior and understood was leadership from nonprofit organizations who presumably are doing direct service work, right? And then their job is to kind of be the intermediary between community. I made it really clear once we got to that table that that is not community as far as Research in Action is concerned. In this context, community represents those that are either been a participant in the bail system themselves and or their families have been directly impacted by the bail system. That's who we think we need to center and speak to. Depending on the question and the intersection of that question, who is community is a different answer. And I would also argue that we don't need intermediaries. I don't think that's a good way to go. I don't think that's an ethical way to go. That also requires your engagement strategy to be more grounded than it is like grass tops, so to speak. There's a question that was asked about the challenges of PAR, and I'm going to answer them in two ways. One, there's challenges that I think are articulated through an academic lens. And I would say what I would argue is the biggest challenge to any participatory approach, in my humble opinion, is that we're often agnostic about actual structural change. Most strategies are. So they'll talk about change in community, right? They'll talk about skill development. They'll talk about active participation or development of language or, et cetera, et cetera. But there really is, in most, if not all, academic iterations of participatory engagement, no outspoken commitment to structural change, because in short, they say we can't control what the folks with differential power do, if they actually engage in what we produce after we leave, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue, for me, that's the biggest challenge of doing this work in the academy. Also because the academy has its own clock, so to speak. And I think faculty members have their own golden handcuffs, so to speak, as it relates to that clock. So in my mind, I see that as the challenge worth noting amongst other things. But the challenge that we actually encounter as practitioners doing this work in community, there are three groups of people that become challenges for us when we do this work. The first group I call tolerators. These groups come to Research in Action because media recorded public displays of discrimination, lawsuits, or an extreme loss in revenue or public support forced them to come to us. They're skeptical of our methods and even question the value of what we do. But because we are well respected and they want to save face, they reach out to us anyway and are referred to us and dragged to a meeting to explore the possibilities. I typically don't take on these partnerships, and I only do so after the organization invests time and resources into doing their own internal diversity, equity, inclusion work, which we offer to support, but many choose not to do so, so they weed themselves out naturally. The second group I call the inspired equity performers. I happen to enjoy working with this group the most. They have equity-based language down. They have a few token employees of color and data illustrating how they have engaged with marginal communities. But they're struggling to understand why their work outcomes don't match their well-intentioned energy. These entities often want to learn and grow, but need support, guidance, and a model that has proven outcomes. However, within this group, there are two subgroups. The first is the radical imaginer, and the other is the colonized thinker. The radical imaginer is willing to take risks, responds well to criticism, and does more listening than talking when welcoming co-collaboration with community. The colonized thinker asserts their thoughts and opinions any chance they can get, resists the process they signed up for, and at times will use the fact that they bring more financial resources to the table as a way to try to convince or influence the direction of the partnership. As Audre Lorde said, you cannot dismantle the master's house with the master's tools. I've worked with both of these types of inspired equity performers. The last group that we work with that we find challenging is the dreamer. The dreamer has all the right language, is deeply grounded in community, loves the framework of the process that we lead, but absolutely hates what they feel like is a reformist agenda. To be a reformist means that they are willing to work within the systems that currently exist, and to be more radically leaning typically means that you want to completely dismantle the entire system and create a new one. I've certainly described these extremes for clarity purposes. Even among some of my peers, we wholeheartedly disagree about these theories of change and its nuances. However, for myself and my team, our work needs to attend to both, but front load the need to produce winnable, tangible change in the short term, because the communities that have gone underserved and under-resourced for decades are now our co-collaborators and need support and resources now. I think this requires us to develop innovative solutions within systems that were never meant to serve these populations, while helping organizations and entities begin the building blocks of the radical change that we would all like to see take place in our lifetimes. I think, outside of the three entities that I encounter, time is always the element. If you really want to do authentic, engaged work, if you want to have the impact you do desire, you need to reimagine your sense of time. My projects, almost 90% of them are multi-year projects. There's a reason for that. There's also a reason that, for instance, the eviction support that we did, the data came out and we won a Minnesota Supreme Court case to expand rights for tenants, or where we actively participated in the tenants' rights ordinances in the city of Minneapolis. That took concerted time, effort, and energy. It's not going to happen overnight.
Can I just add quickly? I hesitate to follow that that analysis, but another important consideration is decision-making capacity. What I found, and I recently did some work with a colleague, Melanie Bertrand from University of Arizona, a piece we called "Why Power Dreams Deferred." And basically, the analysis was about decision-making capacity. And of course, not all participatory research projects are working toward a particular kind of policy change. But for those that are trying to engage with the structures that Brittany's describing, often what happens is around these intermediaries, right? It becomes PAR gets used, right, and then handed off to what we describe as sympathetic decision makers, right? But what we actually found is that it's a very unreliable transition, right? That PAR in effect needs to be participatory all the way through, including in the capacity for decision making and for change making. So part of the challenge is that structure that could or should, I think, most effectively be in place prior to the research engagement process, right? To say like, okay, so we're not just engaging in these participatory practices, but what are our decision-making capacities, right? Where do the practitioners actually get to say what gets implemented, where money goes, right? What, do they have a vote at least, right? Like what are those capacities so that we don't have to just depend on sympathetic folks who actually do have those decision-making capacities, when the research often comes back in ways that, don't align with their theories of change, don't align with what they think are the problems, don't align with, right? And then it can easily be brushed off and that interchange. So I'll stop there.
Brian, I love that you shared that. And then something else that's super important to the process that we lead, when I talked about that shared meaning-making space or the shared value space, we also are really clear with our partners that whatever the question was you thought we were going to be asking, you have to be willing to change it. We're really transparent in the beginning of our process that if your intention is to control the direction, how we question, and what it looks like, we're not the right partner for you. So there's a point in the process where we have to get on the same page about what is our strategic coalition connected to our values and our understanding of existing data. So where are the gaps? And perhaps the question that brought us to the table really isn't the right question at all. But you have to go through a process that's intentional to be able to discover what that is. And I think it takes time and intention, and it also requires everyone to be vulnerable, humble themselves a little bit, and also develop shared understanding together. Because we usually are either working in silos or talking past one another. And I always tell folks, half of my work has nothing to do with research. Half of it is people work. Half of it is people work. And you would be really shocked some of the things that folks think are novel, and they're just connected to being human.
Anyone else want to weigh in on this question of pros and cons? And I'd also sort of have so many questions, and we have like 5 minutes left, just not nearly enough time. But just to sort of weave into the conversation this idea about who is and what are who are community, I think is a really important question. And I think thinking about who participates in participatory research. So this sort of ties in a question that I saw in the chat about system level actors and what that looks like. So just to sort of add that into the conversation. Keep the floor open.
3 quick thoughts just to highlight, I think, what Brittany and Brian were saying so well. One is that when institutions invite in PAR projects, as opposed to when movements, that when institutions invite folks in, the frame of the problem is usually like, what's wrong with those kids, or what's wrong with those teachers, or how come those mothers, or, right? So, and what happens in critical PAR, like what happened in the Philadelphia Negro when Du Bois was hired to figure out what's wrong in the 9th Ward. Why do those people keep getting sick and not going to school? And he flipped the script. He knew he was being hired with a racist question, and he flipped the script to look at history and structure. And I just want to underscore Dr. Lewis's point that critical PAR lifts up the structural, the historic, and the social institutional. It shifts the unit of analysis. And we now will never work alone with a single institution that's defining the issue as what's wrong with those whatevers, without opening up and bringing a broader lens. The other side of what I think you were suggesting is that when we ally with movements, there's often a frustration with what Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore would call kind of non-reformist reforms. And yet people need some things right now, even as we're working for a more radical set of possibilities. So, you know, sometimes folks want to be policed differently rather than just abolishing and those are intra-community tensions. But if you have the right people at the table, those issues will emerge, and that is serious inquiry. I think the worst experience on par is when you get called in by an institution and they shut it down. And there's a kind of betrayal of whether it's the women in prison or the young people who you have encouraged to imagine that there's an audience that's worthy, and there's not. And so in our projects, we always begin with, we write a letter to whom is our work accountable, and then who's our audience. And those aren't necessarily the same. Accountable to local struggles, but audience might be Governor Cuomo or not, or state legislators. So we have to answer different questions and to keep that tension alive. But also, just as a footnote, like, we pay everybody for their time. It does take a lot of time, but we have an ethic that whenever we get a grant, most of the money goes out toward paying co-researchers. Even if they're in prison. So we figure out how to get the money to their families. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, of course, we have 2 minutes left, and I want to go, maybe I'm going to see if we can maybe go, we'll push into the break just a little bit, because I do want to go around and sort of 2 questions. Pick one that you'd like to answer. So the first question is just, who's doing this work aside from you all really well? So I think a lot of times questions that we get in these kinds of panels is, how can I get involved? How can I learn about this in my area, or who's doing this work, or how do we, collaborate? So that's sort of a first question. And then the second question is this bigger idea. I would love to hear folks, and I've been given the all clear to take an extra 5 minutes. Great. So I would love to hear folks talk about just this bigger question of reimagining justice. So this is the theme of our conference. How does something like PAR fit into what it might look like to reimagine justice?
Maybe begin with the opportunity to flag a project that I think is really wonderful and innovative. It's scholars Veshla Weaver, Tracy Mears, and Gwen Prowse. They developed this project called Portals, and what they're interested in is they wanted to instigate conversations about policing from those in criminalized communities. Right, and the conventional way would be to do interviews, or to do focus groups. What they did is they created these things called portals. What they are they're actually shipping containers that are they're created in a way that people can go into the containers and talk with people in other cities, countries, and have these incredible discussions about policing in their daily lives. And so it's actually, they might get a prompt from the researchers, but it's completely led by the people that go in there in the completely unstructured conversations. And they've just produced amazing data about it that is incredibly illuminating. And I think this is it's a really innovative way of thinking about actually engaging folks on their own terms, as well as creating conversations across place that are incredibly difficult to do. So I did provide a link to the folks that I think they're putting up. So just one thing that I wanted to flag. So I'll stop there.
Hey, could you repeat the question, please?
So just 2 questions of examples of this work, and in particular, perhaps if you've seen examples of this work related to sort of the criminal legal system that you want to boost or shine light on. And then the second question is just this broader idea of reimagining justice. So what role does PAR play in reimagining, transforming our current system of justice or injustice?
I think to that latter question, I think can play a huge, impactful role in reimagining justice. I've had the honor to be the lead on a number of amazing PAR projects that have done just that. I mentioned the evictions report in changing Minnesota Supreme Court legislation. Let's see, we have done work with some local foundations to have them reimagine where they put their equity dollars. One foundation we worked with invested $25 million based on a PAR process that we conducted. We also were able to use our research to get a funder to invest $500,000 in redesigning Hennepin County Emergency Assistance. We worked with Twin Cities Habitat, who came to us, who had acknowledged that their homeownership and financial coaching program was not serving foundational Black households. We did a community engaged evaluation project with them. They have now overhauled their entire program. They've hired new staffing. They've reimagined the model, and they're now going to their board with structural change components that community brought to the table. I think it's very possible. But I determined that the partners that come to the table and the ethics that they bring and their willingness dictates a lot of what the outcomes, will be in the end. And I also realized in those spaces, it's hard to hear some of the things you would hear in these participatory engaged spaces. We also bring in healers to all of our spaces. We contract with a number of community healers as a result of that, and knowing that it's not just the research question, right? We're building relationships here. We're actually giving people space to talk about harms. We're also giving organizations the opportunity to humble themselves and figure out how to do more listening and talking, but then also build new partnerships and relationships. That's not easy. Half of it is the people work. And if they're willing to engage in it, we also provide breakout spaces for the healers and folks who ever need to walk out because what we're talking about is too hard. But I think something I also want to make note of, there's a difference between call out culture and call in culture. And I'm often teaching my staff and the folks that I work with about what that is. So one thing that I say always, so we have to leave our ego at the door if we're ever going to do this work. Because call out culture creates divides, and where we might see whether it's a colleague or a community leader or others doing things that might misalign with the goals. Your investment should be to call them in, but when you call them out, it's your ego speaking. Because at the end of the day, if we're all here for structural change, and we're all here to ensure that those folks that need the resources, support, or their voices to be raised up the most, it should never be to call out. You got to put some things aside, I think, to have those really hard dialogues. So I think there's deep transformation in engaged work, but it's heavy. And half of it has nothing to do with collecting data.
So I think that's a great place to end, although I don't want to end. Let us go 5 minutes over. This is such an important conversation. I encourage you all to continue to engage in this conversation with us and with others. You can find resources, some of the resources that folks have mentioned. So some of the studies that have been done are in the conference portal. So I encourage you all to check those out and stay engaged in this work. But I'm going to wrap it up there. And thank you all so much for joining us.